I am going to introduce our first speaker, who is Marc Levy. He's the Deputy Director of CSIN, which is the Center for International Earth Science Information Network, and it's part of Columbia University's Earth Institute. He also teaches at Columbia in the School of International and Public Affairs and directs the new Environment, Peace, and Security Certification Program in the School of Professional Practice. He's a political scientist focusing on how humans can better manage complex, interlinked, systemic risk with a major focus on climate security dynamics. If you can say all that in one sentence, that's pretty good. He was a lead author on the IPCC Fifth Assessment chapter on human security. Marc, thanks for joining us.
So if you don't have indigestion already, I hope to give it to you during this talk. So I was asked to provide some thoughts about how the current El Nino is unfolding in a different global context than the 1997-98 El Nino to which it's often compared. A lot of the comparisons that I come across focus on the meteorology. How big is the SST differential? What's the likely prognosis for how it will unfold? And what are the likely weather impacts around the world? But there are other things going on in the world besides sea surface temperature. And the social, economic, political impacts that this El Nino will have will be a function of the interaction between the weather and the underlying socioeconomic conditions. And if you turn your lens from climate to social change, you see that there are many parallels to the dynamic within the climate sphere of beginning to experience non-analog conditions. We're in the exact same boat in the social sciences. We're in a period of rapid social change. Before we started calling the current era the Anthropocene, a lot of people referred to the current era as the era of the Great Acceleration, referring to the dramatic exponential increase in a range of socially driven pressures on the global environment triggered by the Industrial Revolution. Although in the long arc of history, human well-being is headed in a much better direction than it started from, many of these trends are not favorable from a risk perspective. So what I hope to do in the course of this little talk is sensitize you to the many ways in which the world today is less El Nino friendly than the world in 1997-98. This is an awesome diagram from the 5th Global Environmental Outlook produced by the UN Environment Program, chapter on drivers. And it comes from a publication by Robert Costanza and colleagues. I understand the PowerPoints will be available to people, but the references are either there or I'll add them there. In this audience, I probably don't have to belabor this, but in the social sciences, I often have to point out that the current El Nino is taking place in a different climate, right? So it's here I just overlaid the monthly global temperature average this year against 1998, and then in terms of the big picture context, I put a smoothed average for the whole time series. To show that the increase in global temperature since the last El Nino historically it used to take about 60 years to get that increase. And then we experienced it in 40 years, then in 20, and now in about 15. So that's a big delta. Population growth is one of the fundamental underlying drivers that's still going through rapid change. This is our newest representation of the subnational distribution of global population. So it's up over 1 billion people since the last big El Nino. And unfortunately, and this is a caveat that I have to make frequently, the change is occurring in the most dangerous places. So the most rapid population increase is in poor urban areas, combination of urbanization and high fertility rates in poor countries. So in 97, 98, we were adding about 3 million urban residents in poor countries annually. Now it's 7.5 million. Rapidly increasing poor urban populations is a very dangerous thing to have going on because they are vulnerable to food price shocks and they're easily mobilized for nasty business. Because of the improvements in data technology, data accessibility, we can now do pretty fine-grained examinations of where the population growth is taking place. So this is some very rapid turnaround work that our colleagues at Biosciences did. So this is a picture of the 97-98 El Nino in terms of precipitation anomalies. So the dark red are precipitation deficits and the dark blue are precipitation surpluses. So what we can do now, which we couldn't do in 97, 98, is we can overlay the areas of extreme impacts. So what they did here is take the surpluses that exceeded a 30-year return frequency. It's the top map, and in the middle, the areas of deficit with a 30-year return. And then overlaid our population data. And so then we can compare the population just within those affected areas. And so that's an increase of 230 million since that 97, 98 El Nino. So that's just like basic demographics. And then it gets worse. So another situation in which the world is in a non-analog state is a period of sustained elevated food prices. There's been some good harvests and favorable trends in the short term, but it's a short-term improvement against an elevated, very high baseline. And so we're still in that high baseline, which is roughly 60-some% higher than in 97, 98. So this makes people who are vulnerable to food price spikes even more vulnerable because their baseline is more dangerous. So moving into politics, we are experiencing a condition of systemic transition. Periodically, the world goes through swings of democratization, authoritarian, backsliding, and so on. And the long-term transition we're in is from lots of authoritarian countries to lots of democratic countries. So that's good. However, in order to get from one state to another state, you have to go through a transition. And most countries who go through that transition don't go through it overnight. It takes a while, and sometimes it can take a long while. And the condition of being neither fully democratic nor fully autocratic is the most dangerous political situation to be in. Those countries are at the maximum vulnerability of political instability. And the risk coefficients are plotted in that lower left. And so you see that middle group, that neither strongly autocratic or democratic or the highest risk. And we were at that peak already in 97, 98. So this is a case where we haven't gotten worse, but we're still in that very dangerous place. And it is a non-analog place. That we have not had a world political system at that level before the mid-90s. Partly because of that transition that's going on, and partly because of other things that we haven't fully understood yet. The world is going through a reversal of the trend towards increasing peace and stability that began in earnest after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we're now seeing an uptick in political violence and instability. And this is not driven only by that trend in weak political regimes. There's other things going on, and as I said, the scientific community has not yet explained this. We just recently started observing it. But it certainly makes the world more dangerous and more vulnerable to short-term climate shocks. And one way in which we're seeing that is in the increase in refugees and internally displaced persons. This is another non-analog state that we're in. This past year we hit post-World War II peak for a number of people in this condition. And it's in the papers every day, right? But it's even worse than that. The failed states that got onto the agenda in the early 90s are coming back with a vengeance. And it's not just entirely failed states, but a pretty dramatic expansion of territory within countries that's becoming ungoverned, where the central government has largely given up on the ability to try to govern those territories. And these areas are increasing. And I was going to apologize for the maps. The best map I could find of this was from Bloomberg.com, and the only way I could get it was through this prepackaged graphic. But really, collectively, I think our responsibility to do a better job. There's no reason that this data shouldn't be in the IRI data library, right? Why not do an overlay of climate extremes against ungoverned areas? It should be much easier to do that than having to wait for the journalists to do it and then cookie cut it off of the website. That's an opportunity for us to exploit. And it's a way in which the world is much more dangerous. Our capacity to respond to complex humanitarian crises and political crises is lower than it used to be. And this is a case where we could do with some better metrics that synthesize this. It's something that should be tracked. We should probably have a dashboard that tracks this regularly. So this is just a couple of indicators. At the top, I show the trend in global food stocks in terms of number of days of global consumption that's accounted for in stocks. And so the two things that are going on here is that total number is much lower than it used to be. So it was high in the 90s, and now it's shrinking. And there's many reasons that are driving that shrinkage that are good. It's partly a reflection of getting rid of agricultural subsidies, modernizing management of the global agricultural system. There's a lot of good stuff behind that. But it does have a negative consequence that in times where you have to mobilize lots of rapid food aid, it's harder to get a hold of it. The spot prices are more vulnerable to rapid increase. Also, a lot of those stocks are in the private sector and in China. And so if you take out stuff that's in private hands and in China, the stuff the G7 governments can get their hands on right away, it's a really small number. And the lower graph is just showing the trend in government deficits. And that's just a tiny piece of why it's hard to mobilize support for foreign aid. There's many other reasons besides that. But I think we would all agree that it's harder to get people behind massive humanitarian and political response than it used to be. So this is all stuff that's changed since 97, 98. And I'm arguing it's all alarmingly bad. And so one reason it matters is that we now understand that El Nino and other short-term climate shocks have the potential to trigger big dislocations in social political systems. And so hopefully you already have all read this article from Shannon and colleagues that was the first paper to show that El Nino is predictably associated with elevated levels of political violence. So the relevant takeaway is the ochre, orange, whatever that color is, graph on the right, which shows a roughly doubling of the base against the baseline risk of an outbreak of a civil war in a country that's strongly teleconnected to El Nino in an El Nino year. In the last El Nino, Suharto was forced out of power after 31 years of dictatorship. Having a dictator in power for a long time is another risk factor of political instability. So I went through the list of long-standing dictators, and there's about, I think, 8 or 10 that are like over 20 years in power. Mugabe is very close to the length of his tenure today, as Suharto was in 97, 98. So I'm not predicting that Mugabe is on his way out this year, but it's an example of the kind of stability and risk that we should be expecting when we have climate extremes on the horizon. When there's baseline fragility and vulnerability, a shock that is associated with El Nino in teleconnected areas has the potential to trigger things that then can cascade. So the adjustment to Suharto's ouster was not terribly cataclysmic in broad historical terms, but who's to say whether a hypothetical case of this transition would be? I don't know. It could be bad, it could be good. So I promised to embed this in a discussion of the implications for risk. I think compared to 97, 98, we live today in an era of risk. The Anthropocene is what the geologists call the current era. I think some of the social scientists would call it the era of risk. We're much more worried about it than we were before. And we're worried about systemic risk that can have the potential to teleconnect across multiple sectors in multiple complex ways. And the worst case scenarios today are far worse than they were in 97, 98. I mean, we were almost Pollyannish in comparison back then. Today, we are worried about, extremes all the way to genocide, and even with a small probability, but a non-trivial probability, things like interstate war among nuclear powers. So we live in a sort of more dangerous world. So that means our audience is different. It's the whole group of people that worry about all these things. And the information that they need is different than the kind of things we were worried about before. So among the implications is a need to embed what we're doing more effectively in a multi-risk community and in multi-risk analytical frameworks. Thank you.
Time for some questions. Thanks very much. So, unless you're too depressed to ask.
So there is a microphone?
I don't know where the microphones are.
Okay. So
just yell and we'll repeat it.
There. So there's a paper by Max, Levy, and what's that? Oh. There's a paper by Max, Levy, and Lisa that shows that the years where you have an El Nino, you have more disasters. The difference is that those disasters are more predictable. And if I listen to your talk, it sort of implies that in an El Nino year you will have more risk, more conflict. Is that what you're saying, or you're saying that in any case where you have extreme climate, weather extremes, you will have that type of risk increase?
So I deliberately did not try to cover the positive changes that are underway, which mitigate against these worst case scenarios. And the predictability is something that helps dampen the human impacts from El Nino. All I can say is that the historical record shows quite clearly for these big cataclysmic failures that kind of are a result from the aggregate impacts across multiple dynamics. There's a very clear association with higher El Nino and teleconnection and higher risk. That doesn't mean that the water managers, the agricultural extension agents, they might not be doing a better job and might be mitigating some aspects. But societies are still vulnerable to complex patterns of pressures that are triggered from these changes that affect broad biological and economic systems. So even though it's possible that we're getting less risk, it wouldn't be a prudent thing to do to assume that we are. And certainly we know that the short-term climate shocks remain very potent and dangerous.
Is there another question?
So Marc, one of the risk contexts that exists now, of course, is the climate change problem. It's a lot different than it was back then, and we're witnessing an example where political conflict may be influencing, to some degree, the current COP21. How do you see El Nino fitting in and associated impacts fitting in to the climate change risk discussion and vice versa?
Well, I think that the climate risk discussion, such as it is very misshapen and incoherent. And the entry of political conflict as one of the risks we worry about has partially accentuated the desire to do something, but it's also mucked up the agenda. And so I fear that whereas like 15 years ago, we could talk about a full integration of the interannual variability and the long-term climate change agendas to help people manage the whole suite of risks in a more coherent, effective way. My fear, I wish this were not the case, but my gut instinct is that the events of the last 5 years have made that more difficult because you've got more people at the table, more kind of heated debates, more polarization, more entry of ideology, and all of those things make for less rational discourse. So I think we're in a period of heightened flux, not more integration.
Okay, well, thank you very much.